Leading a startup team, whether you're delivering a sugar rush, stocking coffee, or getting a regular delivery of snacks, Office Depot has solutions that fit every startup culture, from getting those first business cards and stationery to ordering fleece pullovers with your new logo. To learn how Office Depot and the California Technology Council have partnered to bring you savings on all of these startup essentials and more, go to californiatechnology.org/member benefits. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Global innovation activity experienced broad gains across industry sectors last year, according to Thomson Reuters' newly released 2016 State of Innovation report. We spoke to Anthony Trippe, senior patent analyst for Thomson Reuters, about the report, its upbeat outlook, and what it says about the direction of innovation in the biotechnology, pharmaceutical, and medical device sectors. Anthony, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
We're going to talk about the State of Innovation study from the intellectual property and science business of Thomson Reuters. You look at innovation across 12 sectors, but we're going to focus on innovation in the biotech, pharmaceutical, and medical device sectors. Perhaps we should begin with the concept of innovation itself. For the purpose of the study, what do you mean by the term innovation, and how is it measured?
Well, different people have different definitions of what innovation is per se. Sometimes people think about there's the idea of an idea. Yeah, that's the very starting point. You have an idea. Then if you reduce that idea to practice, well, maybe that becomes an invention and something that you might want to patent on. And then if you went ahead and put that invention into practice, started to commercialize it, some people would say that that's innovation at that point. Now, for the purposes of this study, we're talking about invention and innovation synonymously. And that's because the primary metric that's being used here is looking at the number of patent filings. There's an idea called a patent family, which we're actually specifically looking at, because somebody can take an invention, say, and file it in the United States, and file it in Europe, and file it in Japan. And if they do that, we don't want to count all of those different countries. We really just want to count the inventive output. So that's what we're dealing with primarily in this report. There's also a good deal of information about the scientific literature, patent papers, not patent papers, and other scientific literature associated with science, and that's covered in here as well. But most of the material that you and I will be talking about is specific to the patent filing.
Well, how good an indicator of innovation are patents, and do they tell us more about the state of innovation or the direction it's heading?
Well, here's the thing. Personally, I look at filing a patent as a business decision. Patents aren't cheap. They cost quite a bit of money to file. They cost a lot to prosecute. In the sense that you go round and round with these various patent offices and you file translations, and there's a lot of different aspects or a lot of different steps involved before you finally get a granted patent. And then they have to be maintained. And so people don't do that, or organizations, companies don't file these patents just because they look good hanging on somebody's wall. They're a little bit expensive. And in that sense, I tend to look at patents as an indicator of interest from an economic perspective. If an organization is willing to spend $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 for an initial filing, well, that indicates that they're interested in an area. And so that's the way I tend to look at it. That in that sense, it's an innovation because they're interested enough in it Companies generate thousands and thousands of ideas, but they only file patents on some of them. Now, as your other question regarding direction, and what you're talking about there is a good indicator of what's going on currently or the direction that it's headed. And my answer to that would be it's a little of both. Built into patents is this idea of somebody files for a patent, and then it's almost always 18 months until that application gets published. So there's already an 18-month window built into the entire system here as far as filing and corresponding publication. And so, yes, it tells you about what they were thinking 18 months ago when they filed it. At that point, they thought that it was a good idea to spend the money to do this. But it also then tells you that it's going to take a few years for this to grant, for instance, and that's when the rights associated with a patent actually come into play or come into effect. And in the meantime, they may decide to abandon that application, for instance. So if you understand how patents work, if you understand how they're prosecuted, if you understand a little bit about how companies work when it comes to making decisions to file, making decisions to actually follow through to grant, and then deciding whether or not to maintain those documents, that can tell you a lot about how that organization feels about that particular technology, how serious they are about pursuing it commercially.
Before we discuss specific industries, what are you seeing overall? Are there broad trends?
Well, that's just it. I mean, the report makes it pretty clear that this is the most innovative year that the industry has ever seen, as far as the number of filings, the number of industries that are up, as far as year-on-year growth. We've looked back to 2011 in many cases and looked at the growth over that time period. And it just speaks very, very well to the global innovative capacities that we're seeing right now. And that is somewhat to be expected as we are, say, coming out of a recession. And so economically, there's a tendency at times during periods of recession or an economic downturn to maybe invest less in technology and in patenting and so on. And then smart companies begin to realize that there's an opportunity there, and that they can start to gain ground on their competitors if they continue to ramp up their research. And then as the world or a specific country comes out of those recessions and those economic downturns, you start to see these numbers really start to take off. And so it's a very exciting time as far as the development of technology. And you can see that in many different industries.
You also talk about the growing role of collaboration plays in innovation. What are you seeing along those lines?
Well, that's really fascinating. It turns out, for instance, Thomson Reuters has done a separate study on the automotive industry. We've done a separate study on powering the planet and electricity generation. And it's really amazing to see when you look at these lists or you look at these collections in aggregate, how companies that you don't necessarily expect to be making an impact in an industry are. Say the automotive industry, for instance, there's a lot of interest in connected vehicles, self-driving cars. But one of the key aspects to enable that is the development of sensors. Another key aspect is the development of specialized computing power in order to take in that sensor data, interpret it, work with it, and then correspondingly make decisions that impact the vehicle. And so it takes technology from all different types of areas in order to be able to achieve some of these really groundbreaking, earth-shattering, whatever metaphor you want to use, these big leaps, these advances in some of these technologies don't come typically from necessarily the established players themselves, all by themselves, or with the technologies that are traditional to that particular industry. Oftentimes, it's a collaboration and an enhancement of an industry by taking advantage of the technology of a completely separate vertical that allows these big leaps forward.
Well, let's look at some of the individual sectors. I think one of the surprises in the report for me was that of the 12 sectors, only one showed a downtick in innovation from year to year, and that was biotech, which is rather surprising given the level of innovation that appears to be going on. What's happening there?
Well, not to get too much into the weeds, because this is a patent specific answer. Here in the United States, the whole idea of patenting in general is under attack. And again, I don't want to get into the whole patent troll debate and various patent reform issues. But there have been 3 Supreme Court cases that have taken place over the last couple of years that have really had a huge impact on what can be considered to be patent eligible subject matter in the United States, and in particular, what it is to be what a natural product actually is, or a product of nature, I should say. So, for instance, in the biotech area, you have a lot of genetic sequences. You have a lot of biomolecules. Okay. Now, some of these recent Supreme Court decisions call into question whether or not, once those materials are isolated, if they can actually be patented. And then subsequent to that, whether or not they can be used for diagnostic tests. All right. And so you've got a situation where what was patentable a couple of years ago, and what was a big part of what this industry was actually patenting on, is now, at least according to the most recent Supreme Court rulings, not likely to be found to be patentable subject matter. Now, when you have something like that take place, it has a really chilling effect on the industry, excuse me, and the number of patents that they'll file in that industry. Because again, it's not an inexpensive endeavor. And if there's that much expense involved and you don't have a pretty good idea what your return's going to be, or the idea that you're actually going to be able to enforce those rights, well, then companies are not going to file as much. And that's more or less what we're seeing in the biotech area in particular, and especially within some of the subcategories like diagnostics.
That's real interesting. You mentioned it was a year of first for biotech. What are some of the innovations we are seeing?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's an extraordinarily exciting area, and there's lots and lots going on with CRISPR, for instance, which is the gene editing technology. And the fun thing about CRISPR in particular, or gene editing in general, is that while CRISPR gets all the headlines, there actually are a few other established methods, something called a zinc finger nuclease, something else called a TALEN, which is another type of gene editing method that have actually been around for several years already, before CRISPR. And then, of course, there's people have been very, very concerned. There's been lots of headlines about the CRISPR patent wars going on between the Broad Institute and the University of California, and who really invented what, who deserves the patents. And the funniest thing about that is that, meanwhile, the science just keeps going. The whole idea of why patents are allowed in the first place is because people then have to share information. And if they don't share information, then we can't continue to grow. Then we can't continue to have innovation at the pace that we're having it, because people will keep things for themselves, and they'll use trade secrets instead. And so, meanwhile, even while this patent litigation is taking place between who really invented CRISPR, it's being improved. And those improvements are patentable in and of themselves, and those improvements are what's continuing to push the ball down the road, as it were. They're continuing to see new developments, new opportunities, and new ways to apply it, and new ways to improve the technology going forward. And that's really what people should be focusing on with the patent system. The fact that it allows science to continue to grow because people aren't keeping things secret. People are disclosing what they're doing and how they're doing it, and that allows people to be able to improve upon it and apply it in different ways. that the original innovator didn't think of.
If you look at the list of top global biotechnology innovators, it appears there's been a significant innovation in industrial and agricultural biotechnology. Do we have any breakdown on these areas versus health?
Well, it's always a little bit challenging to look at raw numbers that way. And so I wouldn't overlook at the actual organizations in the top 10 exactly. And as far as different approaches are concerned, different organizations, different subgroups will tend to file more or less individual patents or more variations on the same theme than others. And so in the healthcare area, there's certainly a large number of companies, and that's actually showcased in the cancer innovators. So within that same section, there's a list that actually talks about the companies that are working in cancer, and those are listed there. And if you look at the numbers just by company within cancer, say, and you compare that to the sector overall, yes, some of those companies look like they have smaller numbers. But just like with anything else, any sort of comparison either between industry to industry or subsections of an industry compared to the subsector of the industry, you want to be really careful about drawing too much of a conclusion from raw numbers like that without understanding a little bit more about the nuances. While we provide that information overall, it's worth looking at the individual subsections and looking at the companies subsections to get a much clearer picture of what's going on there.
The area of cancer in particular was real interesting because in the United States, the list is really dominated by academic institutions. Genentech and AbbVie were the only corporate players on the list of top 10 innovators. On the other hand, if you look in other regions, it was different. They were dominated by corporate players. Does that suggest anything about the way innovation is done in the U.S. compared to other areas?
I'm not, again, making broad generalizations on a country-by-country basis are sometimes difficult. I mean, taking a look, though, at North America, you do have Genentech as number one and AbbVie as number 5. So certainly the number one company is an organization as opposed to a university or like the U.S. Department of Health, which is in the third position. But it does probably versus say looking at Europe, and again Roche is number one, and you've got a couple of European consortiums or government-based organizations, and then you get to Novartis and Sanofi and a few more, and then Glaxo and then Bayer. And so clearly, this is an area where there's this general idea of collaboration, and because of the complexity, because of the expense, because of the basic research required in order to say identifying receptors to begin with, for instance, these are going to be areas where it should be expected that the collaboration between industry and academia are going to be particularly strong. And again, I'm not sure I would overinterpret the idea that in the U.S., say, it's 2 companies versus 8 organizations. And frankly, you can make the argument that the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute would be another organization. General Hospital is a private organization. And so, but I think across all the countries and overall, you can certainly say that biotech is one of the areas where collaboration is most important because of the different types of disciplines that are required, because of the overall expense and the overall complexity of working in that particular field. And that's always a nice thing to see, actually, that the universities are involved because of what they can provide by way of manpower and by way of academic credentials and brain power. And anytime you see these industries where you've got a strong academic component. That's good to see. That's good to see. Some of the smartest people in the world are associated with those organizations.
On the pharmaceutical side, China seems to dominate in terms of innovation. Is that because they're truly innovating, or are there different attitudes about the standards at which you would file a patent?
It's a little of both. Now, you can't dismiss the numbers out of hand, but it is important to recognize that in China is a fascinating study because they've only really come on the scene as far as being a dominant force in patenting in the last 5 to 10 years. And they've taken the approach that they're going to file very, very broadly in the sense that they're not very selective on what they are going to file. Now, some of this is also the fact that in China, there's different types of patents. Some of them don't get examined. Some of them only last for a few years. Others are ones that are more similar to what somebody would file, say, in the U.S. or in Europe. The thing that I think would be fascinating, we didn't have an opportunity to do this yet for this particular study, but the real question to ask with some of these Chinese patents would be to say, well, how many of them are filed outside of China? And it's easy to do in a sense. Some time has to pass because it takes time for these filings to take. But if you went back 5 years, say, you could say, okay, 5 years ago they filed in China, and then within 3 years they also filed something that's called a WO application, which can theoretically be applied anywhere in the world, or 180 countries in the world. And then they followed up with something in the U.S., in Europe, or in Japan, or someplace else. And compare that to, say, the same industry or the same general topic area and what the U.S. companies were doing and what the European countries were doing. So you can't ignore what's going on. China has a lot of resources. They take innovation very seriously. They take technology very seriously. They have a huge population. And that huge population is going to be needing more and more in the way of healthcare. And so this is absolutely, there is a lot going on, and it's being captured with these patent filings. But again, at the same time, there are ways to look more closely, more specifically at individual areas, individual companies, and start to determine, well, is this something that's really just centered on China all by itself? Or is it, in fact, something that could be applied more broadly across around the world? And generally speaking, when we start seeing interest for protection in some place other than a specific country or market, well, again, that's expensive, and we therefore look at that and say that's an indicator of higher interest.
The sharpest increase in the pharmaceutical sector came in inorganics. Part of this is because this is a small portion of it, but still the most dramatic increase. Can you explain what those are and whether this signals some larger trend to watch for in the years ahead?
Well, thank you. I appreciate you mentioning that it was a large increase on a small base, which you have to be a little bit careful about interpreting. So I think it certainly signals a trend, but I wouldn't say that it's a long-term movement in strategy. Inorganic, in a pharmaceutical sense, would be anything that contains, or any substance that contains a inorganic compound. Organic in the world of chemistry is defined as carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and sometimes phosphorus and sulfur. Right? Those when those elements are present, that's more or less considered to be a organic compound. When you add silicon, when you add iron, when you add various metals, and you likely can recall that for years and years and years, the most popular cancer treatments was a molecule, for instance, referred to as platinum.
Sure.
Okay, cisplatin was actually a platinum molecule that was bound by a couple of other molecules, and that turned out to be a very effective killing substance. And of course, the way cancer research worked in the past was the idea was to kill the cancer cells faster than you kill the healthy cells. But meanwhile, those compounds are actually quite toxic. But they're more toxic to the cancer than they are to the healthy cells. And that's how it works, and why chemotherapy has all of the really dramatic effects that you see when the use of those drugs are done. And then those drugs are generally considered to be inorganic. And so I'm certain that in this particular case, there's been a return to looking at those types of substances. But because we're talking about a small base, I wouldn't say that it's nearly the same as for instance, looking at the biomolecules. So there's a much larger base of research being done in biosequences and in intravenous delivery of biomolecules than what we're seeing in inorganic, for instance.
Understanding your cautions against reading too much into any one chart here, but it was interesting to see Cadelia Healthcare of India on the list of top global pharmaceutical innovators. Does this signal any movement in India towards a more innovation-based industry?
Yes, it does. And there's going to be more and more of this, and you're already seeing it. To use a little bit of a different analogy, years ago, I love to tell the story. I asked people, what does LG stand for? Now, this is an example in the consumer electronics area. LG, everybody says life is good. LG doesn't stand for life is good. LG stands for Lucky Gold Star. Now, I happen to be old enough to remember when my parents bought the Gold Star VCR back in the 80s. And at that time, a Gold Star VCR was just absolutely positively the cheapest thing on the market. But what happened with a lot of the Korean companies is that, they all got into the industry. Samsung, LG, Hyundai, the list sort of goes on and on. They got into the industry by being the lowest competitor, by building the lowest, having the lowest cost of goods, and being able to bring a product to market that was much less expensive than everybody else. But as industries got bigger, economy of scale, manufacturing methods, the race to the bottom doesn't end up being very profitable. And a lot of those Korean companies began to understand the importance of protecting their own innovations outright and not copying others, and then being able to develop their own markets and being able to charge premiums in large margins because of the fact that they were innovators. And so you see now with South Korea and a lot of those industries that where they were once copying and where they were once simply adopting technology from others, they invested in the development of technology and were able to generate larger profit margins. You're seeing something in a similar fashion in India. Yes, they got into the market with the generics. They got into the market with a small profit margin, but as things as they begin to develop and as they start to look for more profitable industries and the opportunity to have larger profit margins, they have gone ahead and started to do their own innovation.
Well, last up, I'd like to turn to the medical device industry, which for years I think has been perceived as a laggard in terms of innovation, but this year far and away leads the pack. What's happened?
There's been two things I think that have really made a huge impact. One, the subsequent question marks around the patenting of biosequences have driven people and diagnostic kits and whatnot have led people to not patent in so much those areas and start to instead use file for medical devices that are associated with those things. because part of the U.S. patent system is that if there's a machine or transformation test that takes place, and so if there is a machine involved or a transformation of some type involved, well, now then that becomes patentable. But now, if you take some of these inventions and apply them to practical methods of delivery and so on, now all of a sudden that becomes patentable subject matter. And it's something that needs to be done anyways in order to effectively deliver these. The second item is associated with that, with the surge in biosimilars. Again, in the delivery of biomolecules, that's included in here. For instance, under syringes, medical aids, and oral administration, there's all sorts of. Those are the areas that are growing the largest, and those are going to be most closely associated with these biomolecules and the biosimilars in particular. Biosimilars, just like generic pharmaceuticals, you can't necessarily copy the exact molecule itself. But if you've invented a better way to increase the time that it's spent in the blood, or you can somehow formulate it so that it's orally available, or you create a mechanism by which the infusion into the body can be done in a more efficient manner. All of these things become very valuable because that's proprietary to your particular formulation of those biosimilars, for instance. And as that area continues to grow, there's just more and more innovation. There's just going to be more and more opportunity for economic growth. And again, generally, patents follow the money. As industries develop where there's more opportunities to increase markets, make markets bigger, and to increase profits, well, then you'll see corresponding increases in patents.
If you look at the list of top innovators, certainly away from the U.S., does this represent any long-term movement of innovation in this sector outside of the U.S. as opposed to U.S.-based?
I wouldn't say that necessarily. I just think it's another one of these situations. Remember, when we first started our conversation, talked about the autonomous vehicle and how sensor technology was required, how computing technology was required. And you're seeing something similar here where there's organizations that have expertise and knowledge in areas that are tangential to what's required to solve problems in this particular field. And they're recognizing that this is fruitful ground for them to be working in as well. And so they're starting to get more heavily involved, even if it's something that they're not traditionally associated with. And so, again, I don't know if that's any sort of country-specific item, but more generally just an idea that as this area becomes more profitable, as this field becomes one of higher interest, companies that have solutions and develop technologies that are appropriate and were originally developed to do something else, recognize that they can be involved with this industry as well. And as they begin to do that, then they start showing up more and more in these sorts of collections.
So is there a takeaway from all this? What does the report tell us about the state of innovation today?
Overall, what it tells us is that it really is an exciting time to be involved with a technology-based business. It's also a very exciting time to when you recognize that what's going on in our society, even looking back 20 or 30 years, and you think about what we were doing back in the 1980s, for instance, compared to what it is that we do today, and think about what we're going to continue to do, even as, say, as little as 10 or 20 years from now. It's this investment in technology, this investment in innovation, this investment in continually growing from a technological perspective is what's allowing us to make these huge advances. And it's just, economics aside, for instance, last year was a little bit of a downturn, and that coincides again with 18 months previously being in a recession. And as we're coming out of it, we're seeing that things are really starting to take off. And it's just really, really exciting to see what the potential is going to be as we continue to move forward. But we're just now at the beginning of the wave hasn't crested yet. We're just at the point where it's beginning to really build up momentum. And it's going to, in the next couple of years, pay pretty enormous dividends in what's going to be available and how it is what sort of technologies are available to society.
Anthony Trippe, Senior Patent Analyst for Thomson Reuters. Anthony, thanks so much for your time today.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.